wonderful program tonight, so I want to get started on time. Thank you all for coming. It's really appreciated. I do want to tell you, those of you that have been here the past couple of months, I'm sorry if I'm being redundant, but we're very proud of this. Our program, Let's Talk About Race, there are 3 programs, multicultural programs, given awards across the state of New Jersey, and there were 3 of them, and we won. Yes. One. 3 years ago in August. So originally Gilda came in and was actually hired and did our first 3 programs, and then for several months I was doing it alone, but now I'm really pleased to say we have a whole committee that works on this program. And in fact, our speaker tonight, Walter, is going to be part of that committee. Patty White is on that committee. Julie Adams is on that committee. Joe Lockett is on that committee. And Diem Jones is also on the committee. And thanks to them, we're able to build better and stronger programs over time. So if any of you have any ideas for this program, please let me know, and we look forward to your ideas. We plan to keep going and going, so we certainly have wonderful material. With that in mind, we have the next 4 programs planned. In July, we're going to have a town hall meeting here, and we'll have a panel, but it really will be about all of you, our audience, to talk about everyday racism and what you encounter. And we want everybody to have a chance to speak. So please do come. Please tell your friends. In August, we're having part 2 of our documentary, Race, the Power of an Illusion. It was a great program when we saw part 1, and we really encourage you to come in August. In September, we're having Joe Grabas, and he's going to be talking about African-American land ownership. And in October, and I want you to all start planning this now, we're having an international night. And everybody's going to be encouraged to bring food and just, enjoy each other and talk. So there are programs for Let's Talk About Race from now through September. I hope we have audiences for everyone, like tonight. Also, we have other programs in the library. We're doing a summer reading program. So for those of you that come into the library, I do hope you'll check it out. It adds a little bit of fun. We also have an essential oils program that's happening in July and August. And then
senior citizens.
For those that don't know, July is National New Jersey Blueberry Month, and we will be having a program on New Jersey's blueberry, and that will be with Judith Russo, I believe is her last name, Judith Crawl Russo. She was here for a cranberry program, and it was great. So I encourage you to come. We'll have snacks too, blueberry snacks. So we have a whole array of things going on at the library. It really is.
What you said for the latecomers.
We have to finish sometime. But it really is. The library offers all of our programs for free, and I really encourage all of you to come. So thanks for coming tonight. Patty's going to introduce our speaker, and I hope you enjoy your program. Thank you. On land of Joe Grabas. Yes, Grabas.
I have a great flyer from a program Joe Grabas did at the Monmouth County Library in Shrewsbury a couple of months ago that I left conveniently at home. Anyway, yeah, he's
we are video recording tonight, and from now on, if you do miss a program, hopefully you will be able to see it.
Our speaker is upstairs collecting his family members, and I think that's them now. So
Do we have enough chairs? Some back. Wonderful. More chairs?
Right here, Steve, so you can do your block. Okay, you can sit up front if you like.
Is this a good spot?
Yeah.
This is like a party. My name is Patty White. I don't work for the library. I just Linda lets me play here. So as I said, we're a little volunteer committee, and we're just so happy to see you all tonight. And we're really happy to have Dr. Grayson back again. He gave a terrific program. Was it last year or the year before?
Last year.
Last year. So I just want to introduce him a little bit so you can appreciate the value of having him here. His resume is a little too long to go into, but he currently is, Dr. Grayson is a professor at Monmouth University, history and economics, yes, and is the dean of the honor school. When he accepted that position to be the dean of the honor school, he had to give up his private enterprise, which was the International Center for Metropolitan Growth. Dr. Grayson is a Freehold native, so he knows, our little neighborhood. His work focuses on contributing to the scholarship about urban planning, suburbs, the African American experience, and the value of the economic resources as a foundation. I know he served on the T. Thomas Fortune Committee to, as many of you know, is a historic building in Red Bank that is very close to being finished, to be opened as a cultural center. He also has served on the Court Street Schoolhouse Committee as their historian, and has agreed to join our little committee here to help us continue with these quality programs. He's the author of a book called Suburban Erasure, How Suburbs Ended Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey, and a couple of others I don't have the name of. What I want to say, in addition to everything, and thanking you all for being here, is to remember one of the things Dr. Grayson said in an interview with the Asbury Park Press was the value of all of us connecting with each other. Speaking as a person who grew up white in this country, I understand it's not enough to just be friendly and be polite. It's about making connections. Just as we wouldn't stand by if some member of our family was having an issue. When we remember we're one human family, we make the effort. And with no further ado, Dr. Grayson, thank you.
Great pleasure to be here again. Red Bank is a home away from home for me, and so these occasions to come and be a part of this community are always very special to me. The joy I feel is a little tempered because of a series of things that have happened in the last few days. Most notably, I guess, today, the news about the retirement of Justice Kennedy and the implications of what that means for American law over the next generation. And so, in some ways, as deeply upsetting that may be, or as deeply inspiring for others that may be, this is an occasion to look at this particular moment that we're in, and yeah, I got you. There you go. As deeply troubling or inspiring as this moment may be, this is the time to look back at where that started. Where did this tension, where did this friction, where did this anger really take root? Where the sense of building community, really spoken so well, Pat, where did that get lost? And it's deeply entrenched in literally what happened here in Red Bank in the middle of the 20th century. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to walk through some of that, but I do want you all to feel this is a forum to talk not just about the history, but about where we're all at right now and what we can do together going forward. In fact, that's a big part of where I'm going to close up with my formal comments. I'm not going to go for an hour. I'm probably going to be like closer to 30 minutes. I grew up in Greek churches, Methodist, Baptist, and Pentecostal. So my church day would routinely go to 12 hours. That was just Sunday, that didn't count. Bible study and choir practice. That was my connection here at Red Bank Calvary Baptist Church, and did extraordinary work for me as a child to help get a sense of my spiritual foundation, as well as the importance of faith in each other and in something greater than ourselves. So, all of that said, I do need to give you guys the basic framework of how I'm going to go at this topic. The title tonight is Paradise Lost and Found, the Economic History of Red Bank, New Jersey. I am no longer surprised after 20 years of looking through what's been written about New Jersey, but also about the United States, at the gaping holes in what scholars have taken on. There's so much missing from the story of our past. And as many people like me that jump out and dig through archives and find articles and try to stitch together the stories, and we have some really distinguished folks that can't go further without acknowledging Randy Gabriellen, who is the most distinguished historian of Red Bank. Numerous publications that everybody should purchase. And so if you haven't read Randy's stuff, definitely go out and pick it up. Marty Verbaum, one of the instructors who worked with me 25 years ago, 28 years ago. I should have put a number on that. Former state planner in charge of putting together a lot of the ways that New Jersey grew in the last 30 years. And so I'm very honored that you guys will be here with us tonight. Lots of members of the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation, the leadership who have kind of carried forward. Family members also, the folks who have come out to rally, and brothers from the Red Bank Men's Club, a distinguished civil rights organization that have made this place and carried us forward as a community. All of this is an example of what was possible, but the fact that we are still relatively few in number, that this kind of initiative is not something that we're doing at City Hall, and we have 2,000 people out rallying around this, speaks to the lost moment that I'm going to focus on. That in the 1950s, Red Bank had a really amazing chance that didn't exist in very many places across the country. And so I want to give you the background to that. How did we come to that point in 1950 where Red Bank could have made a different choice that would have really reshaped the way our civil rights history unfolded and prevented this kind of division and tension that is so common in our daily news cycle. So to get there, you have to know a little bit about how I do the work that I do. So most historians that are trained to do this work focus on one of two areas. Almost all of the history that we tend to teach is political history. That is, when do presidents get elected? When do monarchs change in terms of power? Laws being passed, judges and their particular rulings. That's kind of the benchmarks of how we tend to teach history. Very important, but not the complete story. This is kind of flashes and moments that then change the way the society operates, but it's not everything. The complementary story to that tends to be a little bit more dramatic, that you'll get off of like the History Channel, tends to be about the military, or more broadly about technology. So military history, the history of war, the history of how conflict between civilizations unfold, that's the second kind of most common way we teach this stuff. That dominated the field. Like nobody did anything else in terms of studying the past professionally between 1880 and like 1910. So it's about 30 years of just politics and war. That's all we study, and that's why you see so much of it. It's been around longer. On the flip side of that, people like me who have been trained in like the last 20 to 30 years, well, probably a little more, like 50 years, we're trained as social historians. So, social historians study the way that people's lives change, individual people's lives change. How are families formed? Where do churches come together? What kind of work do people do on a daily basis? The kinds of foods that they eat, different migration patterns, how do people move from place to place at different points in time? Those granular, kind of forgotten moments are really what historians have been trained to do for like 60 years now. Not just to settle for the big law being passed or a massive conflict of, Nagasaki being bombed. Like, we don't just look at the flashpoint. We look at the entire tapestry of what happens to human beings. In between that first phase and that phase that has shaped the way I work, there is a window to study economic history. And this really started with a guy named Charles Beard. Beard was the first person to write that the importance of the US Constitution was not really political. It wasn't about the three branches of government. It wasn't about the way citizens were given the right to vote or how they chose representatives. The importance of the Constitution was economic, that it was about landholders deciding how they were going to build free markets. And so that shift, which happened right before the First World War, changed everything. Historians got really tense about fighting out with each other. What's really the important thing to say? What should we be focusing on? And since then, economic history has unfolded in a lot of ways. Probably the most controversial moment was about where I'm going to wrap up this talk, is in the mid-70s. A book called Time on the Cross was published. And Fogel and Engerman basically talked about the economics of slavery. And they quantified, was this a productive economic system? Did it actually generate revenues that would justify the kind of moral problems that it posed? And it was hugely controversial. People felt like they were putting dollar values on the amount of blood people were whipped from their bodies. And so there was just this ugliness of commodifying human suffering and turning it into a form of currency. And it caused a giant split. Everybody went in two directions. Either the economists said, yes, we need to understand the fundamentals of how markets evolve, and so dealing with the moral ugliness is kind of what we have to put aside to make rational judgments. Or historians said, putting numbers on bloodshed and pain is entirely horrific, and we cannot take any kind of reasoning like that seriously. So we're not even going to take any numbers as the way we study the past. We're not going to put numbers on valuing pain and horror and genocide. Like, we're not going to do it. So that's been like the last 40 years. And so, probably not smartly, but again, I wrote a book about erasing Black communities in the suburbs. So I'm not someone who shies away from a challenge. I jumped into that void, taking the social methods and actually coming up with a way of measuring the actual economic value. And bringing the historians and economists back together and saying, you guys really should talk to each other. So that's been my last 6 years, and that's the framework of what brings me here to you guys tonight, is showing how Red Bank's growth came at a real human cost, but then measuring that cost more accurately. How do we come to a place where we see there's extraordinary growth in the kind of architecture and streetways and the way the fresh water is provided, the expansion of all the piers that are across the river. All this built environment is extraordinary, but it comes at a significant cost, which is why I'm so happy the T. Thomas Fortune folks are here tonight, that we're able to prevent in that specific instance, at a site where a man in the first decade of the 20th century was able to build the civil rights movement 50 years before Martin Luther King took a stand in Montgomery. And we don't tell that story. We don't tell the story about civil rights activism in the North. And we very nearly, like within days, lost that story, that the house could have collapsed and it just would have been built over. And a generation from now, no one would have ever known that it had ever existed. So that kind of moment in Red Bank is the kind of thing we need to do more of. And that's what I'm going to walk through for the core of this talk. And so most of the time when people talk about New Jersey history, they talk about the kind of Revolutionary War, and maybe they'll get around the Civil War, mid-19th century. I recently heard some folks were doing more work around early 20th century Red Bank and kind of the emergence of the local textile mills. I guess the Eisner factory has been something of a subject of conversation recently. I'm going to jump a little bit beyond that, okay? So I want to frame that with a particular moment that's not key to the Eisner factory or World War I itself, but the expansion of Fort Monmouth. Not formally in Red Bank, tremendous impact on how Red Bank evolves. And this is not just true for Red Bank. It's really important that as you look at the past, you understand where the federal government establishes military bases, there is a commitment to flood resources into that area, both financial and human and technological. A lot of the work I do for the university outside of coordinating the honor school is explaining to them that Monmouth University wouldn't exist without Fort Monmouth. That the idea of having a scientific technical training institute at the shore was made so there would be ready labor to come in and manage the signal communications core that they had built to kind of monitor the way European relations would unfold and ultimately the way we could kind of contain the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So this entire region is shaped by those kinds of technological breakthroughs, particularly radio and satellite technologies. And if you ever want to do a whole other technological history, we could talk through all the pieces of that process. How did Fort Monmouth build the fact that almost all of you have a cell phone? That I can connect to a wireless set of information systems to project information for this talk. All of that is a product of Fort Monmouth. And it brought an extraordinarily educated middle class to Red Bank prior to the Great Depression. So Motorola essentially built the core of what, when I do the economic analysis of how occupational change happens in the US, in the 19th century, the main way to become middle class was to become an attorney. If you got any kind of basic legal education, you had a shot to live a better life than your parents had lived. In the 20th century, it's very different. It's an engineering. You get an engineering degree in the 20th century, your earnings go up, the ability to own a home and a better quality home, all of those things increase really dramatically. There are other applications it applies to as well, but that's the biggest one. Like you didn't have engineers in like 1830. Like this was an occupation that had to kind of become professional and emerge in the 20th century. But Fort Monmouth, beyond places like Eisner, had this fundamental effect on Red Bank of creating an educated middle class that wasn't just a summer resort population that came out to kind of be on the river and spend some recreational time away from the city. So with Fort Monmouth's effect, this unfolds for most of the century. It's like 70, 80 years of continuous investment, subsidized growth as a result of the federal government's interest in containing foreign threats. And so you could go to Eatontown or you could go to different parts of Shrewsbury and you could see different impacts, but Red Bank really had a decided impact, a really positive impact. So much so that when you go back and start to look at the effects of the Great Depression, so between 1928, 29, and like 1941, early 1942, you see a lot more consumer habits taking root in Red Bank, that there's a stability. There are people who have to go to the welfare board, that have to cope with the fact that they can't feed themselves. Like there's still poverty and deprivation. You don't have any records of Red Bank, like Front Street, stacked high with bodies of folks who couldn't survive, just couldn't make it. It doesn't happen. Red Bank was more stable and generally better, more well off than other places that had much worse outcomes. Now, unemployment still spikes, the kinds of foreclosures of business still happen, but it doesn't just hollow out the entire community through the 1930s. In fact, it's that period when Red Bank begins to kind of, well, in one sense, recover from a topic I do a lot is the influence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. That body had basically set up a way, I guess the most horrifying story is a guy Randy introduced me to, is Basie Bruno. It's the children of Italian immigrants who runs for sheriff here in Red Bank. And despite being Catholic, despite the Klan loudly attacking the fact that Italians should not be in the United States, he adopts the Klan mantra and joins the Klan, and then he starts winning elections because he's a member. So it's this transitional phase where you start to see immigrants finding ways to belong, finding ways to kind of receive public acclaim, to be recognized as leaders, and not be, as anybody who knows Red Bank knows, Italians were all segregated on the west side too, right alongside African Americans. And so that process of change and then the abandonment of the Klan, in the 30s, these families started to become middle class. Immigrant families started to kind of gain a foothold here in Red Bank that just transformed the area between, I'd say, 1933, 34, and 1955, 56. It's kind of a golden age in Red Bank, despite the Great Depression, despite the war effort, because capital's coming in. Folks are educated, they're adapted, they can find new ways to keep their house, keep their family afloat. And so that's really the starting point. Red Bank in the 30s and 40s is a place of real affluence and prosperity. The primary exception being, although not to the extent that it is elsewhere in Monmouth, African Americans did not have access to the same ability to create businesses in Red Bank, but the jobs that African Americans got working for these middle-class white and immigrant families were much more prosperous than African American jobs in, say, Freehold or Asbury Park. People did okay, they did better here. And so you had the seeds of an inclusive middle class by the time you come to 1945, 1946. That generally, you still had working African American families. Well, okay, big case I talk about in the book is Count Basie. So as a child, horrendous poverty, family can't make ends meet, that's why he flees the area as a teen, trying to find a way to make money with his music, can't do it here in Red Bank, but then he comes back as his world famous celebrity, and he's constantly building and expanding opportunities, running events every year to open up scholarships for people to go on to college, to open up cotillions so that people can start to build family relationships and networks and Greek letter organizations so that the black middle class will continue to grow. So Basie's a really great case of showing that moment in the early 1950s, that there was a chance, I'll even say 47, 48, up until about 56, where Red Bank could have brought people of different races and religions together in real commercial partnership. There were people with the means, they had the income, they had the education, they had the resources, that if they said, yeah, I see the way the country's going, in fact, the state, for the first time in American history, took on an anti-discrimination clause when they revised the New Jersey State Constitution in 47. So the state of New Jersey adopted the principle. And they just had to look at that and be like, yeah, how do we do that? How do we make it happen? This doesn't happen. A colleague of mine's out at Wichita State, named Robert Weems, has a book called Desegregating the Dollar. And the really famous example from the book is he talks about the Negro League baseball system. That there were the original Negro Leagues in the 1920s, they folded and collapsed, there was a new set of Negro Leagues that emerged in the late 30s and survived into the early 50s, but the cases, Jackie Robinson, 47, very talented player. Branch Rickey think he has the right attitude to come in and play and take the abuse to be in the major leagues and show that it's possible to have an integrated league. And the story that Weems tells is that Robinson's integration as a Dodger is not this kind of celebratory moment that we try to make it. Certainly starts to set the table for Joe Louis and builds off of Jackie Robinson and opens up kinds of doors where we take for granted that we have an integrated sports landscape. But what didn't happen was the ushers that worked Negro League games never got jobs at the Negro League games. Vendors who sold goods at Negro League games couldn't sell at Major League games. Most notably, the owners of the Negro League teams couldn't buy even partial, limited ownership shares in the Major League teams. That it was the integration of labor, it was the integration of the employment, folks at the entertainment level of the sport, not integration vertically through the entire structure. That's exactly what happens in Red Bank, is that the way, and this is why I talk about it, is that it's not just true for Red Bank, it's true for the entire country. It's seen as too hard a leap to bring these two groups of middle-class professionals onto the same playing field, onto the same market, and have them work together. In town after town, and Red Bank's a great example, segregated facilities remain segregated facilities. That is, they're just for black residents. They're not given access to East Side. It's like, it's funny, I say the word East Side to folks in Redmond, like, there's no East Side, there's West Side. Like, no, this is East Side. It just looks normal. It just looks like, oh yeah, that's like Red Bank. Nothing different about that. But being able to bring someone like James Parker Sr., not just onto the force, the medical team at the Riverview Hospital, and say, oh, you have access to practice here now. But say, no, you're amazing, you should be a supervisor. In fact, why don't we put you on the board and you can help us find more folks like you that'll come in and be a part of this. It's impossible to imagine. And so that's the breaking point. There's a split that happens by the mid-1950s because of that. On the one hand, the white middle class becomes the heart of what many historians have documented as a real booming consumer suburb. Car ownership rises, small business ownership expands. Things like the GI Bill really multiply the amount of wealth coming into white Red Bank. Like, there's a lot more. And white Red Bank grows itself, like the idea that Italians or Jewish people wouldn't belong as white Red Bank residents kind of fades away. Like, there's a blending. Who talks about that? Nell Painter. She talks about enlargements of what it means to be white. And so in the 19th century, Irish Catholics couldn't be white. By the time you get to John Kennedy, it's okay. You're Catholic, but no, don't worry about it. And so that process happens among African Americans and people of the African diaspora too. So Philadelphia, the 1820s, if you weren't from Philadelphia and African American, if you moved up from Maryland, if you're like Frederick Douglass, you weren't OP, you weren't original Philadelphia. So blackness kind of evolves as migrants come together and culture changes around them. So all this process is constantly unfolding, but the economic effect is that it splits. And so 52, 53, you're seeing the chance for highly skilled black professionals to own business, but their businesses are still kept to exclusively African American clientele. Like, there's no effort to bring them into serving the white consumer public that's really growing very rapidly, becoming very positive. That makes this area a suburban area. And so the consequence is that you have someone like Catherine, Elkin's wife. It's the first mayor, first woman to be mayor of Red Bank. She comes in and she's pushing on the boundaries. She's trying to find ways for more people to have an opportunity. But it's very much like legalese. They're getting access to entry-level kinds of opportunities, regardless of their experience. If they had had 30 or 40 years, they're still kind of at the bottom rung of the ladder after a career of excelling in their field. And even with that, she catches flack and gets pushed back and ultimately is voted out of office and spends most of her career working through the state Democratic Party. And so Elkis White tried to kind of press the edge, but it couldn't really deal with the structural limitations, the inability for people to break through and open up new doors, really create an integrated structure for the society. That left the door open for her opponents, two guys that I know most folks haven't heard of before. Stanley Wilkins, who she beat in that mayoral race in '51, and James Auchincloss. Auchincloss comes up a little more. But these are folks who are essentially white moderates about commercial development. But that commercial development doesn't include African Americans. They're not going to be part of the way the shift towards a consumer suburb, and really in Red Bank, a place based on banking and finance, is going to evolve. The growth of insurance companies, the growth of the banking network, which I'll come back to at the very end. That's not about including all people with a chance to kind of stimulate or grow new investment, to invest in their homes, to expand small business, to get venture capital, to get a large enterprise off the ground. That neglect, that resistance is a really virulent form of something that happens in Virginia following the Brown decision, where basically a movement springs up to say we will massively resist any attempt to desegregate. And so this is the thing that kind of bothers me for scholars that do this kind of work. They love to talk about the I Have a Dream speech. They will talk about CORE and SNCC and Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and be inspired by the efforts for people to open up politics broadly in the 1960s. Very rarely do they talk about massive resistance, which is the body of people who were organized under names like the White Citizens Councils. These are distancing themselves from the Klan. They don't intend to kind of bomb and burn crosses and intimidate the way their parents or grandparents may have, but they're going to aggressively use every political tool and every financial tool at their disposal to prevent any kind of desegregation. The most famous cases people documented, the opening of separate academies. So if the schools are ordered to be integrated, no, we're going to take state funding and make sure we open a private academy that as a private enterprise does not have to include people from different backgrounds. Thousands that still survive to this day. So massive resistance really starts in 1956, and in perfect honesty, it hasn't really stopped. Massive resistance is the root of the kinds of politics we're seeing every day. That we believe that people from different backgrounds should never come into contact. That any attempt to assert human rights protections for different populations is misguided. It's a threat to national security. The kinds of language that we use to reinforce that if you are poor, if you need health care or you have a disability, you're somehow a threat or a subversive or socially undesirable at the minimum. All of that has language throughout the way that massive resistance tried to preserve a pure society. And they would say white, Christian, or for the family as God intended it. There's a lot of really amazing kinds of language that still persists over the following 40, 50 years that folks just don't recognize. It's become encoded and it's become accepted, and we don't realize it started with this effort to undermine the possibility of a red bank finding a way to integrate and include people, no matter where they were from. And so that massive resistance really kicked off locally after a riot here in Red Bank in 1970. So it was a minor riot. It's not like Newark a couple years earlier. But several buildings were burned, police had to be called out. There was an effort to contain the west side and keep property damage there as much as possible. But that then fostered this reinforcement of the politics that really drove Douglas White out of office and out of the area. That effort by 72 had led to 30% surge in unemployment on the west side, 50% increase in crime rate annually. That drug addiction was reached an unprecedented scale, is up over 100% by year. And so the types of issues that we began to kind of deal with in the 1980s about crime, violence, unemployment, those were all already happening in Red Bank by the mid-1970s. And folks were actively shunning, not just the west side, but fleeing from Red Bank, period. And finding ways to live in Tinton Falls or Shrewsbury or Homedale. They're like, yeah, not gonna hang out here. It looks like it could go bad. And so by the 80s, the early 80s, both under Kane and Whitman, you have this disinvestment from county and state institutions that essentially any kind of public employment where you could work for municipal government begins to shrink. And overall, those were the main jobs that enabled the black middle class to survive in that period. Most notably are the contractions after 1989 of the employment force at Fort Monmouth. And so as you begin to see the shrinking of this kind of pool of technicians and engineers working at the fort, the decided impact is on these black middle class communities, not just Red Bank, but Red Bank by being so prosperous, you can see the changes most dramatically. And so when you start to get to the turn of the century and the Ford is basically on the last edge, they're going to pull everybody out and move them down to Maryland. Lots of the folks have retired. The person I focus on the most in telling that story is Erman Jones, who was the Equal Employment Opportunity Officer at the Ford. A lot of work in Neptune and Asbury Park. Those kinds of folks, these professionals that a lot of these guys in the men's club either are or they know, that marks a period of both decline and stagnation in Red Bank. That while Homedale and Colts Neck just explode as these just extraordinary suburban enclaves, just ridiculously wealthy, and frankly, where I'm from is out in Manalapan. Manalapan was like 3,000 people in 1960, and it's up over 30,000 now. Completely different kind of place because of the shifts in where we allocated the funding, how we encourage different kinds of suburban construction. The Raceway Mall is another great allegory to kind of juxtapose that building and its expansion against the collapse of Fort Monmouth. Like, that's a political choice. Like, we don't need to prosecute the Cold War as much anymore. Let's get everybody to shop. We want you to take out some credit cards. Don't worry how much you spend, you can pay back eventually. That kind of process really hollowed out a lot of the working class and formerly potentially integrated middle classes of the shore communities. And so it's at that point we come to the 9/11 attack. These places had very little. I mean, people were fleeing from Red Bank right up until 9/11. And years after, you saw this move of the large financial firms out from Lower Manhattan. They're like, oh, we're too tightly bunched together. This is a target for folks who don't like us. And so whether it was Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, or Eastern kind of Fairfield, New Haven, Connecticut, or Red Bank. Front Street, Broad Street, a lot of new firms last 10, 15 years, and enormous prosperity. That Count Basie money should come to the T. Thomas Fortune House, But there is all this revenue, there is all this entrepreneurship, there is all this innovation happening here in Red Bank, but it is concentrated very much on the east side. It kind of ignores and is replicating the same kind of barrier that we've seen evolve since the mid-1950s. So that's why I really want to come and sit and be in the room with you guys tonight. I know there's a bunch of other stories, and so I hope we can hear other people's individual perspectives on kind of the frame that I put together here. But I had 3 challenges to really lay out for us to start to talk about. First one's pretty easy. So since I came back to Monmouth, yeah, let's get the idea of it. I'm not going to play all of these. I've been teaching a business and economic history course for the business school. A required course. I see about 200 students a year. And they basically track different kinds of economic change, different facets of the kind of process I've been telling you guys about. And so I probably have almost 1,000 of these projects now. And don't worry about reading all of it. You just kind of catch the headline. That's enough for now. But I have them do their research over the semester and then convert them into these short films that basically talk about economic change that then go up online. And anybody can benefit from them. And they build. Like, this one was from 4 or 5 years ago. And so the ones that students just completed in the spring are much more sophisticated. I just haven't had a chance to get them up online yet. But what I'd like to challenge everybody in the room and anybody who knows, who can pass the word to, is I need more students to research these questions. You know, folks, even if they're as young as 7th or 8th grade, I have projects that they can take on and complete at their grade level to go and advance this kind of discussion and to understand the way their community works, their state works, and what role they can have in the way the country and the world economy is evolving around them. So that's a simple one. You know, there's ways we can partner with the library, partner with any of the groups that are represented here to build that out with young people to do these kinds of research projects. The second one is a little bigger. These escalate dramatically. If you know me well, you know this is kind of what I do. With a simple challenge, then we get more ambitious. Second one is tied to the T. Thomas Fortune House and the kind of segregated divide that I hope I've laid out for you here in Red Bank. There is what's called an improvement district on the east side of Red Bank, where developers are given tax abatements and incentives to create new businesses and enterprise. Very interested, and I believe Mark is here somewhere. There you go. It's actually his idea. Build an arm to pitch it. We need an improvement district on the west side that encourages and brings investment to local renters, local homeowners, so that they can get their own small ventures up off the ground. And I think the Fortune House is a great place to center that, where people can come together, hear how to get the resources they need, build their first business plan, take small steps, micro-lending, learn how to manage budgets and get off the ground, start to create multiple streams of income for their households. I do this in like 16 other cities, a company that I had to stop doing because I'm focused at Monmouth. This is the type of thing that would support the Fortune House, but also dramatically increase the level of prosperity for individual families here in Red Bank. So if you're interested, I'd love to talk with any of you that are here about creating an improvement district for the west side. The third thing, so that's big enough, right? Whoa, venture capital, west side, I don't know. But if we're really going to take advantage of the fact that we do have some substantial new capital in Red Bank, I do think we can do more to replace the kind of investment that Fort Monmouth provided. And so, I don't want to scare you guys to give me the actual quantitative scale. No, you're saying bring it. You know me. You guys are already familiar. So, if we're talking about a business improvement district, it's probably above $50 million. Kind of. I'm being really conservative there. It's actually a little bit higher. Doing something with the Fort Monmouth site, that's an Amazon scale project. That's billions of dollars. And so there are partners who are interested. The one that I know most directly, I got Shad. Not Shaddy specifically, you know, I hit him for $1 billion. Shaddy Unit is a great classmate of mine from Basie School, we grew up together. But another classmate of ours has access to that scale of capital. And so bringing in the folks who love this area to find a way to do the scalable projects that really make us competitive in the global market, that's possible. It's not off the table. That's the kind of thing we need to do. We can't really bring back the West Side, even with an improvement district, without something beyond Convo. Yeah. So you get like a little company there, and they're not little, they're doing all right. Or you look out in Homedale, the Bell Works site, you can go on like iSIMS, database management folks for human resources. They're promising flowers out there, but we need a garden. We need a much more wide array of what we can grow in this area. And it's just criminal that we have this empty site sitting there that could be purposed to actually create real wealth if we come together and share what we know and actually make a pitch to bring the resources here. So those are my 3 requests, challenges for the folks who came out tonight. It's the core of the theme was Paradise Lost. We had this moment in 1950 where we could have done something really amazing, and it went fast. Here in 2018, 2019, despite, you know, the music was going to kick in, despite all of the horror, all of the really difficult issues we see every day, we can do something absolutely miraculous. So I hope we'll find ways to do that together coming forward from tonight. Thank you. Just really quickly, I'm sorry. I have copies of my book, so if anybody would like to pick up a copy and take home, please. My son is laughing at me like, stop selling. That's for dinner money, man.
Grayson family members, raise your hands.
Oh my goodness.
Timothy Thomas Fortune was a African-American civil rights activist, author, journalist, brilliant genius. He was born into slavery in Florida. He eventually made his way north. I can't tell his biography the way others can, but he lived in Red Bank from 1901 to 1910 on Dr. James Parker Boulevard. If you've gone past it, you see the renovation that's going on there. He's a person who was almost lost to historical memory, but thanks to this group and many others, he will be remembered for a really long time. Has everybody signed in? We only want you to sign in so we have your contact information so we can remember to invite you to future programs, and we hope that you'll tell your friends and come join us every month. So let's just have some questions.
Snacks, everybody can get to snacks.
Actually, the library closes at 9, so we usually wrap up the conversation around 8:30 so that you can have snacks and that you also can talk to each other and make connections and get his cell phone number and whatever you need to do. So who would like to comment or make a question?
Tell your story. Yeah. Wow,
That's just a question. The opportunity lost in 1950 was, are you interpreting that as a case of massive resistance?
Yeah, I mean, I won't say it's as virulent as Wilcon. You didn't have somebody standing out on the street, although Parker Jr. told me a crazy story about being a kid and the Klan marching down St. Thomas. So there was some nastiness behind all that. But by the mid-50s, it was, what's that phrase? Nixon used it, benign neglect. Oh, they'll be okay, we don't have to do anything. Just leave them over there. There's more of that. That's equally a form of resistance.
Money is power. And if black folks get money, they get power. What's different about 2018 with respect to how the prevailing culture is going to not only tolerate that, but foster it and nurture it? How is it different today than it was in 1950? Seems to be, from where I sit, it's pretty ugly today.
Maxine Waters would be dead right now. So, yeah, anybody, this woman who just won the New York 14th District race will be right behind her. Like the notion, the single biggest advance of what changed in this period is the presence of elected officials. You had one of the senior leaders in the Congress was Muslim from Minnesota. Yeah. Keith Ellison. And so these are types of things that were impossible in the 40s and 50s. It was never going to happen. Catholic now, that's why he's getting pushback. Yeah, Maxine Waters is far beyond that point.
So you're hopeful?
So, no, I'm extraordinarily hopeful. So the work I've done around the country with startups and co-work spaces and helping people find ways to generate new small enterprise, it's hard not to see these amazing people, and a lot of people trying to say young people of all ages, finding ways to build new products and services that make people's lives better. It's really amazing. The thing I find is that it's disorganized and kind of chaotic, and it's not really, it doesn't have the same discipline and purpose to then create and sustain communities. In the best cases, they might help out a household or 2 or 3. They're not really built to sustain nonprofit community centers, the kind of infrastructure that replicates growth over and over again.
Think that organization and discipline won't be met with resistance?
Oh, no, it always is. But I see it overcome more often than not. Yeah.
In your experience, Walter, have you found that the KKK caused demonstrable harm in Red Bank? Which I ask since at least one historian believes there were a bunch of ill-tempered but incompetents that generated intimidation, but not much in the way of actual harm.
Yeah. So that second Ku Klux Klan that
The
emerged.
1920s.
Yeah, when that was at its peak after 23.
The existence.
I find it hard to separate them from the Red Summer of 1919,
Yeah.
which is by far the worst instance of racial terrorism this country has ever experienced. So here in Red Bank, you may not find that they drag somebody down the street with a chain. Yeah, you don't see that in the paper. But contributing to an atmosphere where someone can come down the Long Branch and fire off fireworks and have a spelling bee and run a Miss 100% America pageant, and then go home and feel like they dragged somebody from the truck, because that's how they keep the like good spirit of their celebration alive. That to me is really, really bad. So, no, you don't need to see them in the Red Bank Register shooting somebody on the stoop, although there are lynchings and all kinds of extrajudicial killings in the area too. But no, I would not be like, yeah, they're kind of incompetent, they don't do much damage. They did plenty of damage.
What do you think about the rate that Fort Monmouth is being changed over? I thought it is going very slowly.
Oh no, it's ridiculously slow. I mean, it was held by the federal government and then just managed to get leased out so you could start getting private investors in, but it's been almost 20 years. I mean, it's sitting empty. Everybody's property taxes just keep going up every year.
No, I meant the restructuring of the buildings and all there.
No, because when it was held by the federal government for 12, 15 years, there was no permission to go in and deal with the asbestos and kind of repurpose the entire site. Like, nobody wanted to mess with that expense.
And from what I see in the paper, I'm sure I missed a lot of it, that it seems to be a very expensive thing.
That's the thing, like, what made it work as a fort was that we had a military interest, but then we were willing to take a loss on it year after year, decade after decade. And essentially, that's this place where you've got to have a partnership between state government, local government, and private investment to allow for a loss over a 10 or a 20-year period to repurpose the site. And that happens every day. Like, that's the deal. Amazon is shopping around the country. Be like, how do we avoid losses for the longest period of time, and then we'll put our headquarters in your city? We cut those deals, but for some reason, we drag our feet when it's here in Eatontown.
Sir?
Yeah, you mentioned a missed opportunity to speak here. I came across, I did research, I came across an article when the soldiers came back after World War II, and the GI Bill came. Those that wanted to go to medical school, they returned to any one of 18 states in the South. They could go to medical school there. What did the governors do? They established an area in Tennessee. So if you come back home to Alabama and want to be with your family, you go to med school in Alabama, no. You have to leave again and go to Tennessee, become a doctor. That whole middle class opportunity that was lost. And that was something I was talking to Dr. Parker about. Junior, you know, you take 10 minutes to take care of me, and then that's the rest of the day. With the good talking about Howard, because I went to Howard, he went to Howard, his father was Jim, and boys and all that. He was talking about that kind of opportunity. What would have happened?
You had that many.
If those African Americans could have gone to school, in any one of those 18 states, that the governors came together and said, oh no, we're going to build a school up here.
That's it.
And all of you have to leave and go away.
That's another example of this massive resistance. Like, oh, if we have to do this, this is the littlest thing we can do.
And that was major.
And it's replicated, it's not just doctors.
Nurses, doctors, dentists, medical.
Any of these technical fields, any of the kinds of engineering professions. The one that kills me is like, can you imagine, let's take one hypothetical just immediately. Dr. King doesn't get shot. Just number one, all right? Just imagine working with even just Robert Kennedy and learning that he could invest in something like Apple. And so Dr. King is 80 and is richer than Oprah. Like, to me, that's the kind of stuff that's just like, just to see if there was little bits of access to the next phase of how the economy is going to change. Massive, massive kinds of benefits. Like, you're not going to see Black Lives Matter out there marching and blocking highways trying to figure out what was the one that horrified me. After Prince died, found out that he was throwing concerts in cities where children were killed and then donating the proceeds to the family. It shouldn't be like an entertainer's individual philanthropy trying to prevent social injustice. That's really where we're stuck. Oh, I'm sorry, somebody was thinking. Did you move on? Yeah. That's you.
As Walter mentioned, I worked for the state of New Jersey for almost 20 years, and I worked on and off on a project involving the New Jersey State Plan. Most people don't remember the New Jersey State Plan at this point, but it started in the mid-1980s and carried through to the early 2000s, and it's pretty much been on. But it started out as an affordable housing plan. We were concerned about the lack of affordable housing in New Jersey. And then it kind of morphed into concern about the loss of farmland and open space in New Jersey, that New Jersey was going to be entirely built out. And then that led to the identification of a number of regional centers in the state, Red Bank being one, and what we wanted to do was concentrate state funds, infrastructure, investments, and program money into these regional centers to kind of slow the spread and the sprawl that was taking over New Jersey. So when I come back to Red Bank now, Red Bank to me looks like a success story because it looks like it's much more vital, much more activity than was here when I was here in the 1990s. And it's also true of a number of other regional centers that we work in. So places like Somerville, Morristown, New Brunswick, Freehold boroughs, they all seem to have gone through something of a renaissance in the last 10 years. So,
that Freehold borough went a little bit. All right.
so I'm asking you and asking people here, from the Trenton perspective, what are we missing? How have we fallen short? Because from my perspective, coming from Trenton, it looks as though then we were dealing with problems of decline, and now it looks like we're dealing with problems of growth, and Trenton views that as a big success. So is that an accurate?
I think it's true. I think it's true with some of these samples. So first is the regional stuff. I don't know. I'll kind of start with you on this point. Y'all see the debate around Central Jersey last week?
Oh, it's
Central Jersey. Stephen Colbert, John Stewart. Like, I think it's a good thing to kind of sample that, whether you go up to New Brunswick or look further north, suburban ring. And the guy I know who would come back at it is Howard Gillette down in Camden. And the story of Camden and Newark and Trenton itself and bigger places than Red Bank. The ridiculously horrible roller coaster ride at Atlantic City. Those kinds of places that look like, if you look at them in 1940, you would think, wow, what's going to happen next? This is amazing. And you could never anticipate. I don't know. Folks go through Camden Live?
No.
You know, like, anybody in Trenton wants to tell me, oh yeah, we're all good. I was like, go take a look. So there's those kinds of stories at the biggest level, right? Smaller stories like the west side of Red Bank that are just resilient in intergenerational poverty for the last 50 or 60 years. Where was the one someone just had me do a report about was Edison Township, a little bit further north. They had a place called Potter's Crossing. It was a very prosperous black community. You know, lots of folks, high education. And I couldn't believe when they first showed me like the document. It was probably not quite a square mile, so not a big place, but all black-owned property, all black-owned businesses. And they had carved their own roads, they did their own water management. And then it wasn't Toll Brothers, it was one of the bigger developers, came through and just purchased up everything, decreased. Everybody sold to get away before they were the last one down. Then he plowed the whole thing. And just completely rebuilt over it, put out stuff like the McMansions and the Alvin. That's growth, right? You know, properties are worth more, you know, it's more affluent than it used to be. Yeah, but see, gentrification is this thing where it tends to be in urban spaces. I'm trying to get more people to talk about gentrification and how do you rebuild small and rural places too. But yeah, those things, like the growth is more complicated, I guess. It's not just like, oh yeah, we won, it was a great thing. There's a couple folks going back, I don't know.
Well, Al had his hand up, and then I guess you, Sarah, Jim?
Okay, I'll make my best. You had said, you know, massive resistance, you know, you were describing that like that. What about pushback against that massive resistance? Did you see it?
Of course, I mean, you know, civil rights organizations, yeah, the Red Back Men's Club. You know, the folks who do that work every day, and they fundraise, and they fight, and they find children to uplift, and get them through against all odds, like absolutely. I just want to make sure that's the rule, not the exception. You know, like there needs to be so much more. It shouldn't be as hard as it is to do that work.
Oh, hi. Nice talk. So I just wonder what you think of the sort of decline in local media coverage and not having community papers and reporters going out to town meetings and informing us what's going on. It seems like, you know, in my community in Atlantic Highlands, we follow what's going on Facebook, and that's how we're sort of all engaged. But I think that there's a lot missing with not having local reporters to, you know, be our eyes and ears, and for us, you know, I just felt like we were much more motivated as a community when we had a local, Asbury Park is not a press, is not a local paper, there's no more Red Bank Register. So I think that, I just want to know your opinion, if you agree that it really contributed to this kind of decline in community building.
Yeah, so I do
and that social media is not really an adequate replacement.
I do a whole other course on kind of media history, and so I'll come back to a talk next year.
Oh, I got next year.
But like, that point, a guy named Neil Postman talks about in a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And it's been out 30, 35 years now, but he's talking about how television and cable television fragments families. Like everybody has their own device, they go off into their own corner, and nobody talks to each other anymore. And it's gotten worse for me with the number of devices. So you guys ever hear of the Internet of Things? Like we're not just supposed to have one device anymore, we're supposed to have like each 6. And so like your house is a device, your car is a device, and you have a phone and a tablet and a laptop, and they just build out all this structure that collects all your info. So you're not just fragmenting from the other people in your life, you're actually fragmenting yourself. So almost everybody I teach has at least 3 email accounts. There's like their email account for their spam, there's their email account for their work, there's their email account for their friends. Like, they have all these different things that they do that they're like, if I'm using this is who I am. And it's like, you're breaking yourself down into this really tiny structure and you're not even a whole person anymore. You're like fragments of a digital self. And so, while Facebook is really good that it gets some communities together, we're not thoughtful about how we use it. The number one thing that I'm most worried about is you just saw AT&T acquire Time Warner. Yes. And in a similar kind of fight, Disney and Comcast are fighting over 20th Century Fox. All these giant media conglomerates are fighting over who's going to swallow who. Like literally, Facebook and Google are just watching to see what piece they're doing. And so we're coming to a place where you're going to have a very, very small group of people controlling an enormous body of information. And we're not going to get to, because the FCC just decided to suspend net neutrality so that large parties will dictate access. And so, as bad as it is now, we're on the track towards it being worse. We're not going to be able to see the range of things that we get access to now. So those are the kinds of things that, when you think about November, you want to ask some really serious questions about people running for office and what they're going to do to kind of allow for more opportunity and protect privacy. So that both people just aren't advocating on your info. But yeah, it's a whole other set of concerns besides just the basic economics.
Yes, I'd like to offer a challenge of sorts, Dr. Grayson.
That's not you at all.
Really, I didn't know. I had a reputation. But part of the dynamics in this country is, shaped by the rules of capitalism. For instance, the Great Migration. Say?
You said the C word.
I did. Yes, I did. Well, you said the C word without the ism, but it's part of the. It's an elephant in the room. Or I just wanted to. Yeah. So the Great Migration from the South, people fleeing the racism in the South, but also fleeing or moving to areas of opportunity in the industrial North after the war, and then those companies, and that was middle class work for blacks and whites, And then those companies were like, we're not paying these union wages, get us out, we're going. And it was legal for them to do that. They were allowed to do that. Shut down their factories in the cities and move overseas, right? And that's still happening to this day. And the peoples of the 60s were shaped by the losses, the job losses. People were impoverished because those jobs were leaving. And I just want to ask, how do we navigate that? How do we, the concentration of wealth since the 70s, we see it happening. I mean, it's remarkable. And that's my one question or point. And then I did want to say, just to, I love your vision of, you're like, let's let the rubber hit the road. Let's be real, let's live life here. Let's, make this a real place. Your pastor, or the pastor at Calvary Baptist Church, talked about Red Bank being a microcosm. He worked with a human rights organization in town. But so I wanted to just say, the gentleman in front said money is power. But we're going to find out probably fairly soon that money, we can't eat it, we can't drink it, we can't sleep in it. It's not going to keep us warm.
Especially Bitcoin, don't trust it.
Yeah, and so I guess I was just going to say localizing food and energy would be another, and I know you're also interested in sustainable businesses, and that would be an interesting thing to make happen, and I'd love for the Fortune House to be a foundation that springboards that.
So there's two pieces. That second piece is pretty easy for me, so I'm going to put a hold on that for just a second. But that first bit about capital flight and globalization and the way that, in 1950 you could have a 6th grade education and be a single wage earner, like you wouldn't need your spouse to work and you support 3 or 4 kids. Like, look around now, it's like, no, each y'all do about 3 jobs, maybe, and then maybe some bills you could put off till next month and not take too bad a hit on it. It's a completely different environment, and it's very intentionally so. The folks who have derived from massive resistance have built an economy that's essentially geared towards, if you cannot build a service or enterprise that is going to employ others, you're not really a citizen. In fact, you're a kind of disposable product. And so all kinds of reforms, whether it's healthcare. The book I wrote back in 2015 is called The American Economy, and it traces the evolution of the idea of property in American law. And property at the framing of the republic is like a small farm, but really it's a plantation. It's like you got a big plantation, and then you can actually grow and be a stable and good citizen. After the Civil War, it shifts to the idea of an oil company or a railroad company. You build a large kind of multi-state enterprise, like they're going to be good. Nobody tells anybody these shifts. They just kind of happen if you're looking at the court proceedings. You can kind of say, oh, that's how they're changing this. So if anybody can guess what they're trying to build now as standard, is what kind of enterprise you need to have. My son jumping in, go for it. Computers. Yeah, beyond the computers, a specific way of doing it, a virtual mall. So not a mall just to buy books like Amazon or buy various services, but the really key mall is going to be how do you hoard genetic information? So if you can actually get everybody's kind of medical profiles and compare to the human genome, yeah, there's really, really big money in that. Race to see who can get a hold of all that information. And this area is really big for it. Hospital systems do a great job with it. But so what you need to understand in the first part of your question is most human beings under the current way that we see economic development are kind of quasi-property. And unless you actually are mobilizing the investment in the organization of that data and that time and that activity, this is why Amazon has made Jeff Bezos $130 billion. Like, it's insane. That's the kind of thing they want my kids and your grandkids and people not born yet. That's the kind of thing they're going to be building the rest of this century. And our rules are designed to reward it. And against that, the thing that I'm trying to do, the easy part, is that a place like T. Thomas Fortune and a really good example is out in Kansas City. I work with some folks out there building a citywide community garden. And so they literally farm along the sidewalks. And so, like, if you're hungry, you can literally reach into a box or a vegetable and it'll be good. So it's kind of beyond the things that we see with the farmers markets where you can go and buy fresh produce, which are good. But we need like rooftop gardens, and we need energy co-ops so that folks don't have to go and pay electric bills. And the other big area is clothing and transportation, all those things that we can reduce the cost for them. You know, like it makes a big difference.
Are you saying that scale is what matters? Like scale is what you're saying? Like
when you have a good idea, try to achieve it on the scale that it reaches the most people.
Yeah.
Jim, Marcia, Tom, and then whoever's after that.
The other, well, we've lived on the west side for over 20 years now, so we've seen a lot of changes, especially the demographic changes. Actually, the African-American population has shrunk considerably since the 90s. Excuse me?
Are there any Chicano, Latino people in here?
Well, that's what I want to bring up is, the other 500, the other elephant in the room is the Hispanic population. Nobody's mentioned the Hispanic population. It's boomed, and I know, like, they've established businesses. You know, you can't walk down Shrewsbury now. There's bodegas, there's restaurants, whatever. So I was curious, you know, you're talking about this economic opportunity area. Well, how are the Hispanics being seen in that?
Yeah, so I'm going to be a little technical just real quick. So,
Could you speak a little louder?
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
No one really tells me that, so I'm always whispering, so I can bounce it off the back wall.
Okay, that's good.
So, what I'm going to start with as a technical point is that I don't tend to think of the populations that have moved into places like Red Bank and Freehold and Asbury Park as Hispanic. Hispanic populations tend to be relatively affluent from places like Argentina or Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador. We see many more people who are Central American, who are kind of Guatemalan, El Salvadoran, very rural, very poor people who have come through Mexico to try and find opportunity in the U.S. And I tend to refer to those folks at the best as Latino, although they give me issues about, that's more about Puerto Rican.
The east side or west side of Red Bank is Little Puebla.
Really specific about who's building here, because depending on what town you look in, Hispanic is a very different one. The Chicano population that you see in Red Bank has had a breakthrough. They're able to start up a few small enterprises that Manning Marable, a really good historian that passed away a few years ago, he was up at Columbia, and I forget. Manning Marable wrote a book about that kind of scale of economic development where it might employ 1 to 5 people over a period of 10 to 15 years, but either a crisis of debt, shrinkage of capital, health crisis in the family, tends to wipe out those little spots. Like, they don't persist. And so in that particular kind of case, what I see happening in Newark that's really good is there are Peruvian communities that are embracing a form of institutional investment that sustains more than just kind of the small storefront enterprise. They're actually building manufacturing and distribution, like they're owning their own trucking companies, for instance. That kind of step forward is much more promising. And can you then build out small enterprises that deal with green energy needs and actual innovation with solar? Those kinds of initiatives that shape a whole industry, those are the things that folks who are marginal need to take on beyond what we see happening on the west side right now.
Marcia?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. Is there anyone here from the Citizens for Diverse and Open Society? Anybody?
Supporters.
Because to me, that group, our group, is an example of your networking of that number 2, the improvement district.
Yeah.
And because I see so much connectedness to what Gilda Rogers is doing as the co-chair, as one of the co-chairs of that group, and Sid Bernstein, what they're doing, and how Gilda was instrumental in getting a huge amount of money so that Mitzi Thomas' fortune house could be saved, and this magnificent place going up now, the apartments after. But it's going to be a whole educational institution. It's going to be for the whole west side. And right across from it, diagonally across from it, lunch break has doubled its size in just the last 2 years. I volunteer at lunch break. So to see the changes there, and I've seen this. And then Citizens for Diverse and Open Society is networking with Calvary Baptist Church. The minister there houses our meetings, and we march together. So I see, I just some of the positive parts coming together in this like microcosm of what we have and this energy that we're putting together. We're also working with the public schools and getting the Honest God project going in the public schools in the bank here. So there's so much to fix, but with energy and with a coherent vision, I see these are examples of how networking
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing.
Dr. Greason, thank you so very much for coming. Every time you come here, I'm going to come back. I've got a million more questions. I'm trying to tie it all back to the topic. Paradise Lost. That key period in Red Bank. What groups are the groups that lost it? Was it government? Was it business? Was it residents? I ask that because I wonder at this moment again, do we have that opportunity to talk, to build with the Latino community? There's no Latino ownership on the east side. There was nobody at the River Center meeting the other night that I went to for the Latino community. I didn't really see the African American community represented from Red Bank. So my question is, so that we can learn right now, are we in another moment like that? But where do we assign blame? Who was at fault when we lost that Paradise Lost moment?
I had a really bad bias at work on when I started my own company. Whenever I saw anything about a chamber of commerce, I got eyes. It was like, yo, what's going on in there? And I never really could make sense of it. It was just clear, like, I don't belong there. Like, it's just the way they would look and talk, and it was here. Mark was there, a couple folks, Lorraine, you were there. We were at a very similar kind of event a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And big real estate fundraiser thing. And it's just very clear, like, I know who to talk to who's going to get me the next big fat deal that I want, and you don't look like that. And so, there's a lot of really easy ways to blame municipal council or a school board or those folks. They don't really dictate access to state resources. They're kind of doing the best they can with whatever provision they're given on a daily basis. So I tend not to blame government because it's really hard, and they take enough blame from lots of other folks. They don't need me to jump on it.
And you can't find who's responsible anyway.
Private sector actors that tend to gather at these quiet backroom places and hang out like chambers of commerce, those folks have an inordinate amount of power and like to be very quiet about how they exercise it. And so I'm a little bit over my chamber of commerce hives. Still working on going into like the Kiwanis Club and the Lions Club all this kind of societies where these social networks go on. Because I spent so much time going around the country into banks and asking and trying to broker deals for small business, I had to get over it. But it's just amazing to me that the folks who do the kind of work that you're really indicating, that so many of you in here do, there's not the same relationship with the private sector to make sure that the chance to grow and expand is there. And, Rodney, I'm always talking about, he had a massive chance to do something. And a group of very well-motivated folks who thought they wanted to do some good things just let it slip through their fingers. Because they didn't know how to recognize the opportunity. And so there's that kind of stuff that even when you get the chance to have this moment, which I do think we have, you've got to know what to do with it. And that's why I'm glad to come out and find ways to move forward together.
This gentleman and who else? Okay, and then we probably should.
Yeah, I'm keeping y'all all night, I apologize. I love this. This is like the best part of all the work I do. So I'm glad.
Mine is just an observation, really. You brought out so many things that I grew up with and I'm still today. Because I grew up in Long Branch, and we always looked at Red Bank as the upper class. Yeah, we felt kind of funny coming here because we had one black doctor in Long Branch, Dr. Kelvin. And now I'm seeing a sort of reverse from almost. There was a time when Florence Avenue was all black. Yeah, it was all black homes, all nice homes, very new homes. Now it's all Hispanics. Every time a home is sold, I rode by our old boss's house today, and there was 5 cars parked in his yard.
Yeah.
Rodney didn't tell anybody, but I was looking at the contiguous book last night. He was a 61 king.
Oh, I gotta get that picture. What?
I had to shoot a picture. This is Dave. I didn't get a picture. And there are people that are Hispanics in Long Branch, Pax Company, the construction company. Someone just bought Conti's car wash that's been there for years. He's doing the reconstruction. He's, I think he's from Brazil. Yeah. And there's and Broadway in Long Branch is like, there's all the Portuguese. And there are people that, I said, the people that pay my house are Portuguese. And I said, in Long Branch at one time, there was construction workers and maids. My mother was a maid. And we all grew from the projects to buying homes, and but now it's reversing. It's coming down. And it's not a good situation. No, it's not. It's a very, and we try to meet and try to come up with different ways to change things, but things just keep going down and down.
Yeah. And then you're absolutely right, and you're not alone with that. I hesitate to go too deep into this story. So I went out to Detroit 4 years ago, and y'all know Dan Gilbert is, Quicken Loans. Sure. Owns the Cleveland Cavaliers.
Yeah.
He basically revitalized like a 2 square mile area downtown Detroit. And then when you go and you look at it, I was in a helicopter looking around at where we could get opportunities for folks. The surrounding 10 square miles have just been torn out and allowed to grow over. Just because it was all blighted. It's all blighted territory. Where it's like no one lives there, it's all falling to pieces, there are no businesses, it's not anything that's generating tax revenue. Just going to tear everything down, push everybody out beyond the city border, and eventually private investors will come back in and rebuild. And it's just unbelievable to watch these kinds of processes happen. And frankly, Jared Kushner's folks built up Pier Village in Long Branch. They're expanding out the Monmouth Mall plan for Newtown. In the middle, that west end of Long Branch.
Yeah.
So
that's how the mayor lost the election, because he fell in love with the Pier Village, and the rest of Long Branch is gone to fire.
So we have time, folks, I think, for,
and I'll hang out if folks just want to like chat, informally.
we'll let Mark and Claire, and then we'll probably have to start,
Very refreshing.
Turn on the music, turn on the lights. Okay, good night.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to get some point to as far as paradise lost, because I know this whole country with Sarah mentioned the Catholic school here, and it seems like we're such a profit-motive country, built on just demand because these corporations are making profit, but, you know, we lose touch though with the loss of community within the claim to say paradise lost. The way I look at, you know, things in the future though too is that we have a source of power in just our own neighborhoods. We could just gather that as a community, and you know, like just what you mentioned earlier, the special improvement district, but even just neighborhoods itself, just gather together and just, you know, taking care of themselves. Because I see that in the future as far as even, you know, neighborhoods having their own small community centers, just like the T. Thomas Foolish House is going to be an example of that. And I'm just wondering as far as maybe, just where this can go as far as with the west side, making improvements to that, being an example. But as far as, I think leadership right now is lost in this country as far as they're looking for towns to gain momentum, we're looking as far as copycat towns, or, you know, we're competing with each other, but we don't know by ourselves that we have the power within. It will become very unique. All right, create our own identity right here and just take care of ourselves. So I just wanted to. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to leave you with a little bit of summer reading suggestion. I read a book over the winter called Ramp Hollow. It's called The Ordeal of Appalachia, and it covers that whole area of Appalachia. And a whole systematic undermining of people, the towns, villages, the schools, the work, the employment, the government selling it for mineral rights, taking the lumber, ruining the land, vegetation, and just the whole undermining of the whole area, forcing people off campus, forcing them to and it's just, and then that whole ideology, and trying to understand that better once you see that happening. Just and it's all governmental,
we probably should wrap up. Our next program is going to be July.
It's the last Wednesday.
25th is the last
25th,
Wednesday.
the last Wednesday, we're going to have
Town hall.
our town hall, which is Richmond.
Patty, could you speak up a little bit?
July 25th will be our next gathering. We're going to do a town hall along the lines of what CNN did a couple of weeks ago, Everyday Racism. We'll have a little panel, we invite everyone to come. Thank you so much, Dr. Grayson.
Well, very much.
Can I make 2 announcements? On Saturday, there's going to be a rally here in Red Bank, keeping families together. They're going to start at the train station and then they're going to work.
Green Park at 10 o'clock.
Okay.
And then walk around to Riverside Gardens where there'll be speakers at 11.
And then on Sunday, all right, also I have T. Thomas Fortune cards, and I'll gladly pass them around. T. Thomas Fortune people, I'm on the case. But on Sunday, there's going to be a Words Matter campaign, and there's going to be a big concert at Marine Park, correct? Yes. Yeah. And so Sunday afternoon, there's going to be a cadre of people and kids, and we're going to be writing quotes of T. Thomas Fortune all over the sidewalks and things like that. So instead of looking straight ahead, look down. All right, because it'll be everywhere. So Sunday, look for that, and Saturday we'll see you at the park. I'll see you at the park.
This is statewide national march. Sarah, I sent you an email.